Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is February 18, 2022, and we've done a couple of videos about the Karen Convoy clan up in Canada, the Freedom Convoy. This is a far-right political demonstration organized by politicians from the Maverick Party and the Populist Party in Canada, or the People's Party. These are people basically who felt that the Conservative Party of Canada was not far right, batshit fascist enough for them. And so they're forming more fringe right wing parties so as to better indulge their anti Muslim, anti immigrant, anti LGBTQ, anti union, anti socialist political impulses. So they formed this demonstration involving truck owners. For what? What are the demands? Are they protesting, the common things you would expect to see from a working trucker, like wages being too low, delivery schedules being too tight, too much surveillance on the job? No, none of that. Vaccine mandates. Even though 90% of truckers in Canada are vaccinated. No, they're going to shut down the border and everything else because 10% of them aren't. Nothing about this makes sense. We're already living through a time where the capitalist governments are tearing down restrictions. We're going to have a video on that tomorrow, how the BA.2 variant or subvariant of Omicron is ripping through countries like Denmark, and it's on its way up in the United States as well. It looks like it's as severe as Delta and more transmissible than Omicron. So, not great. So, the capitalists are already tearing down most of the protections, which is just going to get people killed and severely injured. Even apparently mild cases of COVID can result in massive inflammation and damage to the lungs and other organs. But anyway, who cares, right? I'm in a truck. Honk, honk. You're not going to shoot me full of the Rothschild microchip, white gene destroying whatever I fucking believe because I'm a neo Nazi, even though 90% of the truckers are already vaccinated. Okay. It's a mess. We've covered this in two long videos previously, and one of the things that we covered was a statement from the Communist Party of Canada, which came to the same conclusion that this is a far right demonstration. They're not making demands that actually serve working people. It's a far right agenda which serves the bourgeoisie. Okay, clear enough. Now, Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has invoked emergency powers this week in order to freeze protesters' bank accounts. So we have an article here from Arise News from February 15, 2022. The headline, I think, like the situation, is fairly straightforward. Canada Prime Minister Trudeau invokes emergency powers, vows to freeze protesters' bank accounts. Basically, this thing has been going on for 3 weeks. They're like, yes, your objection is noted, moving on. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this article before we move on to other pieces of information. It says, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoked emergency powers Monday to quell the paralyzing protests by truckers and others angry over Canada's COVID-19 restrictions, outlining plans not only to tow away their rigs, but to strike at their bank accounts and their livelihoods. Quote, these blockades are illegal, and if you're still participating, the time to go home is now, he declared. In invoking Canada's Emergencies Act, which gives the federal government broad powers to restore order, Trudeau ruled out using the military. His government instead threatened to tow away vehicles to keep essential services running, freeze truckers' personal and corporate bank accounts, and suspend the insurance on their rigs. Quote, consider yourselves warned, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland said. Send your rigs home. Freeland, who is also the finance minister, said the government will also broaden its anti-money laundering regulations to target crowdfunding sites that are being used to support the illegal blockades. Trudeau did not indicate when the new crackdowns would begin, but he gave assurances that the emergency measures, quote, will be time-limited, geographically targeted, as well as reasonable and proportionate to the threats they're meant to address, unquote. For more than 2 weeks, hundreds and sometimes thousands of protesters in trucks and other vehicles have clogged the streets of Ottawa, the capital, and besieged Parliament Hill, railing against vaccine mandates for truckers and other COVID-19 precautions, and condemning Trudeau's Liberal government. This is basically an ultra-conservative demonstration. It is also deeply unpopular in Canada. So this is from another article. Section is A look at 4 Canadian polls. The Angus Reid Institute poll says more than 2/3 strongly oppose the protesters' approach and behavior. In the Angus Reid Institute survey conducted from February 11 to 13, 69% of respondents, basically 7 out of 10, said that they opposed the protesters themselves, their approach and behavior, versus just 27% who said that they were supportive of the protesters. 64% of respondents said that they opposed the protesters' demand to end all pandemic restrictions versus 33% who said that they were supportive of the demand to end all pandemic restrictions. Who would want that? We're still dealing with Omicron. Also, like I said, Denmark just lifted all the things and their deaths are going up exponentially. It's not a good idea to do this, to say the least. It's mass murder is what it is. In addition, 72% said the protesters have made their point and should go home now, while 22% said the protesters should, quote, stay in Ottawa and other protest sites until their demands are met, unquote. And while 24% of respondents said the protests have made them less supportive of vaccine requirements for international travel and crossing the U.S. border, the protests were sparked in part by this new vaccine requirement for truckers crossing from the U.S. 44% said that the protests had actually made them more supportive of these vaccination requirements, while 32% said that the protests had no real effect. So you can see they're deeply unpopular, and actually 44% of the respondents said that the protests had made them less sympathetic to the protesters' demands. Another poll from Ledger says nearly 2/3 think that the protesters are a selfish minority. In a Ledger survey conducted from February 4 to 6, in collaboration with the Canadian Press News Agency, 62% of respondents said that they opposed the protest message of no vaccine mandates and fewer public health measures, versus 32% who supported that message. 65% of respondents agreed with the following statement, quote, the convoy is a small minority of Canadians who are selfishly thinking only about themselves and not the thousands of Canadians who are suffering through delayed surgeries and postponed treatments because of the ongoing pandemic, unquote. That survey, like the last one, had about 1,600 respondents, which might sound small if you haven't studied quantitative social science research. However, in the United States, you only need about 3,000 people in your survey to be representative of the entire United States, statistically. Canada, of course, having a smaller population. Third, the Ipsos poll. Strong majority disagrees with the goals of the protests. In a survey conducted by Ipsos from February 8 to 9 on behalf of Global News, 59% of respondents agreed with this statement. Quote, the truck protest is mostly a group of anti-vaxxers and bigots intent on causing mayhem, and they should not be allowed to protest, unquote. 41% disagreed. Now, keep in mind, it said, and they should not be allowed to protest. I would be willing to bet more people agreed with the first half, but said they should be allowed to protest. Anyway, when respondents were asked if they agreed that, quote, while I might not say it publicly, I agree with a lot of what the truck protesters are fighting for, unquote, 63% disagreed. They do not agree with what the truck protesters are fighting for, and 37% agreed. The poll did find that 46% of respondents agreed that while they may not agree with everything the protesters in the capital of Ottawa have said, quote, their frustration is legitimate and worthy of our sympathy. Still, even on this question, 54%, a majority, said that what these protesters have said and done, quote, is wrong and does not deserve any of our sympathy, unquote. Finally, there's the Maru Public Opinion Poll. Nearly 2/3 favor military support role in ending the protests. In the survey conducted by Maru Public Opinion from February 9 to 10, that is the latest time frame, I'd just like to point out, 56% of respondents said they don't agree with the protesting truckers, quote, in any way, shape, or form, that would be a majority, and that everything possible should be done to end the protests. Just 20% of respondents said that they, quote, fully support the protesting truckers, while another 24% said that they support the reasons for the protest, but, quote, not the way they are going about it, unquote. 64% agreed with the statement that, quote, Canada's democracy is being threatened by a group of protesters and they must be stopped immediately, unquote. 64% also supported using the Canadian military in a support role to tow protesters' trucks. and as Ungar Sargon acknowledged in a subsequent tweet on Monday, in which he conceded at least that there isn't, quote, blanket support for the protests, 58% said that drivers who refuse to follow law enforcement directives to move should, quote, face fines and potential jail terms of up to 2 years, unquote. So that is the basic feeling of the Canadian population. Now, pivoting back to the Communist Party of Canada, being, a Marxist channel, this is sort of a point of reference for us. They had, I thought, a very good statement that I covered in a previous video I mentioned. This is from February 4. The title is Freedom Convoy, a dangerous movement for the working class, but useful for the ruling class. The Communist Party of Canada views the Freedom Convoy, quote unquote, as a public expression of the increasingly organized and assertive far right. The clear links between the organizers of the convoy and far right networks indicate that this is not a spontaneous working class demonstration. On the contrary, it is part of a global phenomenon, the rise and mainstreaming of the far right, which is demonstrated by the strong support, ideologically and financially, from the U.S. far right and circles close to Donald Trump and the January 6th insurrection. The convoy is filled with Nazi and Confederate flags, election signs for Bernier, the populist candidate, ex-conservative who went further right, and all sorts of far-right symbols. The $10 million raised through GoFundMe for this convoy also showcases that this was planned by ultra-right networks. It is certainly not the meager earnings of the working class that is funding this effort. So that's just to summarize their statement. It went on for several pages and basically concluded that if this was actually a working class movement, there would be demands for, better public health, expanded medical care, like all kinds of things that working class people would actually want, not the kind of crazy far right stuff that they're talking about. Okay, so now let's go to a February 15th statement from the Communist Party of Canada. This is titled No to the Emergencies Act. Defend civil liberties, enforce hate laws. So, like I said before, I thought that this statement was a bit murky at a time when we're having some trouble, with the Western, quote, left even identifying a far-right movement when it's staring them in the face. Let's read through this article, which I think has its good points, and I think, again, has its sort of more vague points, particularly in relation to the actual discussion that I'm seeing on social media here, which is, quote, leftists parroting, oh, the authoritarian Canadian government is doing XYZ. First of all, a couple of facts. The cops have been high-fiving these protesters most of the time. It's been going on for weeks. And the cops have been incredibly friendly. They let them ride in their police cars and take pictures, and they're generally supportive, which is exactly what you would expect from a reactionary demonstration. Now, do workers' movements eventually need to win over sectors of the police and military? Yeah, absolutely. But if they come out of the gate high-fiving you, there's probably an issue, particularly when G20 protesters or indigenous nation protesters that are going up against a pipeline or whatever are getting hit with water cannons and having dogs unleashed on them. Yeah, there's definitely if you're turning a blind eye to that, you're just deliberately not trying to understand what's in front of you. The Canadian government, which, by the way, this is a socialist channel, the Canadian government is capitalist. The purpose of the Canadian government is to maintain and expand capitalism. That's not what we're looking to do. Fascism, however, is even worse. That's actually what this movement represents. Now, the Canadian Liberal government has been letting them do their thing, again, for weeks. Now they're like, okay, sorry, but you gotta go because you're on the bridge and, we can't get past you, sorry. That is really a weak response. So this sort of hype about it's the Emergencies Act, yeah, but also they let them sit there for 3 weeks. So again, it's a capitalist government. What did you expect them to do? They did it in the most lenient way absolutely possible up to this point. I don't like either of them, but the liberal government, we prefer liberal bourgeois democracy over bourgeois fascism, which is just a tyrannical dictatorship of capitalism. So that's sort of why we're not fans of the far-right protesters in the first place, who do represent something more sinister, more reactionary, even than the existing capitalist government. I think that that's not really a hard concept to understand, but some people are still sort of chewing on it. Please, let me know how I can help to facilitate your digestion of that concept. So, anyway, here's where the Communist Party of Canada weighs in, which to me is basically like they should have dealt with these protesters long ago because they're right wing and it's not a good thing, but they shouldn't have used the Emergencies Act. Again, this is a level of nuance I'm not sure that anybody is really asking for, and I'm not sure that it is the message that the world needs right now, particularly if you look at the discussion that is actually going on social media. That's just my take. But let's go through this. I haven't gone through it word for word. I did, we'll say, closely skim it so far, but let's read through it right now. So, no to the Emergencies Act. Again, this is from earlier this week, a few days ago, the 15th. Defend civil liberties, enforce hate laws. News that the federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to deal with the continuing occupation of Ottawa by the so-called Truckers' Convoy, led by far-right and fascist forces, may sound like a good idea to some, but it is a sledgehammer that will suspend the civil and democratic rights of everyone in Canada, effectively imposing martial law across the country. Though the Prime Minister promises to be selective in using the arbitrary powers he has acquired, the Emergency Act effectively suspends the Charter of Rights, eliminating civil and democratic rights in Canada. I'm just going to pause there. There's a few more pages. So this Emergencies Act, this is an update and renaming of the older War Provisions Act, or War Measures Act. That's what it is. This dates back to World War I, which was, the first major inter-imperialist conflict. And most of the imperialist countries came up with some kind of emergency act. Like we saw a lot of socialists in the United States, for example, standing up against World War I, like Eugene Debs and other people from the IWW and, other socialist type institutions and organizations. And they were thrown in jail just for opposing the war. So that's the kind of thing that this originally was. So then I believe it was also used, this act, when it was the War Measures Act, was invoked to do the same kind of internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II that the US did. And then later, during around 1970 with the Quebec secessionist thing, when the Quebec liberationists kidnapped that guy, they invoked it then. Actually, that was Trudeau's father that did that. So they did it, then the Quebec thing was over, and then they extinguished it, and then that was that. It was later updated into the Emergencies Act, and that hasn't been used since. So they really don't trot this out very often. Trudeau is doing it now to get rid of the truckers expeditiously. The Communist Party of Canada's complaint is that this is a sledgehammer. This is the exact same thing that was said the last time when Trudeau's father did this around the Quebec thing, that, you're suspending all civil liberties. That's not necessary. This is a sledgehammer. The same metaphor was used. I mean, it came and it went, and they honestly don't do this very often. It's fairly typical for a bourgeois government to do things like this. It's, I guess what I'm trying to say is for people thinking that this is somehow comparable to like some massive slide into tyranny, there's already plenty of stuff going on that is extremely concerning that, yes, it's possible that they could say, ha ha ha, we just used the truckers as a pretext to do this and now we're just leaving it this way. Is that possible? Yes. Is it likely? I don't think so. Is it the bourgeois government's right to do that? Yeah. I mean, as far as I see it, it's not the place of communists to advise the bourgeoisie on how best to manage capitalism. That's not our role. Our role is to organize to abolish bourgeois rule. Now, in the meantime, can communists object to things that bourgeois governments do? Yeah, absolutely. But if we see things like this becoming consistent problems, maybe it's time to acknowledge that the solution isn't just to hang out as like critics of capitalism, but to actually, organize for socialism. That is the idea. And that's not just directed at the Communist Party of Canada. I'm just trying to reorient everyone generally to like, what are we talking about here? We're not managing the bourgeois government and they don't listen to us as a matter of course. If you don't like bourgeois rule, then organize to end it. Now, as bourgeois rule goes, how is the Canadian government generally speaking? Well, it's a settler colonial nation that was founded on genocide and remains on ongoing colonization. Within that, how are civil liberties generally speaking? Are people getting dropped out of helicopters and things? No. I mean, it's not an open fascist dictatorship per se, though the entire imperialist world, even the relatively more liberal nations, definitely have shifted to the right over the last 20 years since the whole war on terror thing has been going on. So, okay, that's the context. Is it alarming that they're using the Emergencies Act when maybe they could be using different laws? Yeah, I get that. Maybe Trudeau just wants to be like his dad, who was the guy who used the act that one time, and who knows? Do we have specific reason, though, what I'm getting at here, that this truly is just the suspension of all civil liberties in Canada, the Constitution or whatever the hell they have up there is just gone, and this is it now? No, I don't think so. My personal opinion. But again, if you want to minimize the risk of this ever happening again, organize for socialism, put the bourgeois government out of business. At which point you will really learn what police action in Canada is all about. It won't be a lot of high fives going on. And along those lines, just before we get back to the article, one last thing. What I actually see in a lot of the social media discourse is, oh, what about the precedent? The precedent, the precedent, the precedent. So even if you can get a populist, quote, leftist to admit that, yes, this is a far-right organized, neo-Nazi leaning movement, and yeah, that's kind of our enemies, well, even then, we shouldn't be applauding the, quote, authoritarian government, freezing their bank accounts and doing whatever, because what about the precedent? I mean, they might start doing that to us. And my response to that is, all the hand-wringing about precedent in the Canadian government's actions, which they're treating these truckers with kid gloves so far. One, have you ever been to a protest? Do you know anything about how cops brutalize protesters when it's an actual left people's type of protest? And number two, do you forget, as far as precedent, that the country itself was founded on genocide and ongoing colonization? So the Canadian government is there to run Canada's portion of global capitalism. That's it. That's the point to its existence, and that is what the Canadian government is going to do. They use fascist movements sometimes when it's convenient for them to maintain capitalism. And when it's not convenient for them to use fascist movements, they sweep them back under the rug. But throughout this, they always oppose socialism. So as far as this thing about precedent, yeah, I'm aware of precedent. We do a lot of history on this channel. Bourgeois governments have never been kindly to socialists, ever. But the fact that they are now, after weeks of handling the far-right convoy with kid gloves, they are taking a few swift actions, freezing some bank accounts temporarily to get them the hell out of the capital and stop blocking the bridge and the border crossings. I just don't see that as being that alarming of a precedent, taking into account, the last 150 years or so of capitalist history. But anyway, all that said, let's go and finish the CPC statement. The Emergencies Act is the new name for the War Measures Act, which has only been used 3 times in Canadian history, twice during the First and Second World Wars, and in 1970 during the occupation of Quebec by federal troops. What I was saying. The name change was the result of massive opposition to this use of wartime legislation against civilian populations. The legislation should have been abolished. Instead, is this realistic though? You're talking about a bourgeois government. Do you think it's really going to relinquish its emergency powers? Is that realistic? Anyway, the legislation should have been abolished. Instead, it will be used to do the job in Ottawa that police have already done in Windsor without this draconian legislation. So time out there. This is actually part of the point, and why I think it's not, like from a bourgeois point of view, not particularly crazy that Trudeau is doing this, because nobody wants to get rid of the protesters. There's no end game. The protesters are never going to leave on their own. Like, they're just going to sit there. And nobody wants to do the job. What other, this was basically what the government was saying in the news clips that I was watching about this, is like, nobody else was going to do this, and hence, like, that's why they are invoking this legislation. Yet another reason I don't think it's particularly alarming in terms of precedent or anything else. The thing has been dragging on forever. This is just finally like somebody who's like, I'll do it. So anyway, and I'm not saying this is good. I'm not like a fan of capitalism, although I'm less of a fan of fascism. Liberal capitalism definitely better than fascist capitalism. I mean, from that point of view, taking this step of invoking this, which I would guess that they're going to retire the powers as soon as they have cleared them out. I really have no reason to think otherwise. I mean, I think just the hysteria around this only helps the right wingers. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Let's continue, though. It has been widely noted, especially by residents of Ottawa, that the Ottawa police have done almost nothing and in many ways have facilitated the ongoing occupation. Yeah, police inaction in Ottawa, or you could say police collusion in Ottawa, stands in stark contrast to harsh repression, yes, against Indigenous peoples, whenever Indigenous sovereignty clashes with the capitalist theft of land and resources, or with the mass arrests of thousands that took place during the G20 protests in 2010 or during the Quebec student strike in 2012. So we're on the same page here. The numerous connections between police, state intelligence, active and veteran military personnel, and the far-right occupation has been widely reported. All this demonstrates that new policing, surveillance, and repression powers will ultimately be used against the labor and people's movements as opposed to the far right. Yeah, so again, I think that's actually the message here. What's missing in Ottawa is the will to politically oppose and act against the far-right core of this movement, to use existing criminal and anti-hate laws to arrest and detain all those advocating hate and threatening violence against women, Muslims, Jews, racialized people, immigrants, communists, liberals, and social democrats, and all those who oppose hate. So commenting, fully agree. But when I said that the message is a little bit hazy or vague, yeah, I think that that's super clear. The title, No to the Emergencies Act, definitely gives a different impression of what the whole message is here. That's the title of it. So anyway, the last page of this, working people across Canada have protested in the streets, demanding that the government act against hate, defend public health, hospitals and healthcare workers, stand up for science and for public health measures that could have prevented the deaths of thousands in Canada if they had been implemented early and consistently by federal and provincial governments. Instead, governments have pandered to big business interests, using the pandemic as cover for a massive transfer of wealth to the pockets of the biggest corporations in Canada, while millions of people lost their jobs. Bankruptcies of small restaurants and businesses exploded, and many working people lost everything, including their hope for a better future for themselves and their children. Okay, yeah, but let's tie this back to the headline. It just has nothing to do with it. If politicians are frightened by the mob occupying Ottawa and other locations across Canada, they should be. This is not a protest. It's a political movement of the far right with funding and support from the ranks of police and military, and from white supremacist and fascist forces around the world. The antidote is immediate action using existing laws to protect the public and disperse the occupation. It is to protect and strengthen democratic and civil rights, not eliminate them altogether with the Emergencies Act. So, again, I think that they're not making the case for this very well, because what they're saying is, and I'm trying to offer this, I basically agree, I think, with the position, just not how they're saying it. And then as far as should the Canadian government have used the Emergencies Act, that I think I may disagree with. So the argument here is this is a serious thing. It's not a protest. It's a political movement of the far right with funding and support from the ranks of police and military and from fascists around the world. Yeah, okay, I agree. That's serious. If politicians, more liberal politicians are frightened by that, then they should be, because that's not the kind of capitalism that they go for. Okay, you think that you can keep running capitalism through this crisis without reverting to fascism. Okay, and you don't want the fascists to take over because those aren't your values. You don't want to give up private property, but those aren't your particular values, etc. Okay, but the bottom line in this situation is all of those local and middle levels of government have not done their job. So that's the actual situation that the government is faced with. And Trudeau is there. There is pressure on him. What should he do? I was reading another article that interviewed the heads of the different provincial governments, and they were really split on what to do. So there is a lot of support for not handling these protesters. Yet, I think we all agree, as this article says, they are a real problem and need to be dealt with. So, short of using the Emergencies Act, what specifically are you saying should have been done by the people who were willing to do something? And I say this realistically, like from a logistics perspective. What laws would you have had Trudeau and the people around him willing to invoke the Emergencies Act instead of doing this? And whatever that is, would it functionally have been any different in terms of the discourse that the right wing would be using and the ways that it would be, impacting this sort of movement in the streets and on social media and in public perception? Would it have been functionally that different? And again, I will leave that more open-ended, though I suspect that anything that would have been done, they would have been crying and screaming about it regardless. So you may be right. There may have been another way out of this particular situation for the liberal bourgeois government to make the fascists pack up that wouldn't have resulted in a scenario, would have resulted in a better win. What I'm trying to say is this statement has not convinced me that such an alternative exists, or if it does, that you know what it is. And again, I'm not saying that you don't know, I'm saying the article doesn't tell me that. So what it does go on to say is the antidote is to act decisively to protect public health, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, good talking points. I'm not sure that it has to do with this particular situation at this particular crossroads at this particular moment. So I was mistaken. There is another page, and there is a relevant couple of paragraphs here, so I'm going to read this. Big business may think that the Emergencies Act is a good idea, eliminating both border delays and the right to strike. But working people, the labor, democratic, and civil rights movements, the NDP, the Green, and the Bloc, must speak up to oppose this sledgehammer to democracy, which suspends the constitutional and charter rights of every citizen and resident, despite Trudeau's assurance that he won't act arbitrarily. How far will the Prime Minister go? Just watch me, said Pierre Trudeau when he invoked martial law in 1970. So again, I feel like we're getting away from the core situation, which is, on the one hand, the CPC is saying this far-right movement is scary, the politicians should be worried, it's really alarming, they're a magnet for fascist money from around the world and the United States. And on the other hand, what is your specific alternative here in terms of dealing with the protest or this right-wing demonstration? Because if you're saying that the antidote is to act for a people's recovery, good jobs, whatever, that's not going to take care of this situation right now. Or at least I'm not hearing you make the case for that. I'm not convinced of that at any rate. So the statement closes by saying, the Communist Party stands with anti-fascist, anti-racist protesters who are the real public defenders today and calls on the labor, democratic, and civil rights movements to speak up now against the invocation of the Emergencies Act, in defense of civil liberties, and for government action to protect the public from the occupation using existing legislation and anti-hate laws. So that's the end of the statement. And I guess just, this has been going on for weeks. The people in the cities are sick of it. I've read of reports of 100 decibels, which is really loud. In some of the downtowns, people are trying to sleep in apartments and the horns are blowing and everything else. And, again, this is a deeply unpopular movement. So if you're saying that the existing laws can be used, but they're not being used, give something more concrete as far as a roadmap forward. That's how you can demonstrate some leadership. This kind of general stance, it doesn't strike me, this isn't compelling. And it also doesn't convince me of, hey, this is a movement that we're ready to have a socialist government now. We could handle this differently today. This is what we would do. Follow us. And I'm just being honest, that's how it comes across to me. I observed and took part in a lot of discussions about this topic in the last few weeks through social media, talked with hundreds of people, listened to hundreds of people. And to me, I think that this just helps the right-wing rhetoric in the end, although I do think sincerely that's not its intent. This article makes clear that the movement is far right, fascist, and etc., and then kind of, puts Trudeau's government on the same platform as that for invoking like the only thing that in practice is going to end this demonstration. And again, if it's not the only thing, I didn't get a clear picture of that specifically from this press release. So anyway, I hope that that's clear. This discussion, as far as I've been seeing, has not been a great one so far. Like everything else, it seems like the right wing is just having its day, having its way. Do I have confidence in the bourgeois government to deal successfully with fascism? No. That's ultimately going to be the job of socialists, who are the only grouping and configuration who can actually deal with capitalism in all of its forms. And to me, I guess, if you're not really prepared to deal with that, actually taking on all of capitalism, then why even bother weighing in when arguably it just kind of helps the right wing when you're criticizing the government that's trying to crack down on them? Because they and the people that they're appealing to, they're not going to take all the nuance. They're just going to hear, look, even they're on our side. That's all they're going to get, and they're going to use that, and it's going to work. So, yeah, I have a feeling that this is going to be an ongoing conversation for a while. I mean, first of all, because I think that these demonstrations and the movement behind them are going to be ongoing for quite a while. And I'll just leave it at that for now. I'm sure that you all have plenty of ideas, thoughts, questions, feedback, and whatnot. Do leave them in the comments below. It makes me kind of desperate watching the left not being able to deal with these kinds of questions, dealing with them so badly, fumbling so badly, and kind of, in my opinion, forgetting what this is all about. We're not trying to reform the system. We're not trying to criticize the system. We're trying to end this system. And, whether it's Trudeau's government or whatever prime minister's government, that government has emergency acts at its disposal, no matter what country we're talking about. Like, you can believe that the capitalists, when faced with an actual threat to their power, will use that against us, whether or not they use it against right-wingers. Like, that whole precedent argument is just meaningless. It's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with this whatsoever. So I guess getting bogged down in all this stuff, have we forgotten what socialism is all about in the first place? I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. And we'll catch you in the next video. Bunch of stuff coming up this weekend, including a live stream on Twitch at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. Saturday, catch it live. I'll be on for a couple hours. Plus a Lenin audiobook during the day and probably a COVID update as well. See you then.